Hello, and welcome back to part 2 of this presentation, Integrating Literacy into Vocabulary Intervention. In part 1, I spoke about the importance of vocabulary for literacy. My primary purpose for part 2 and part 3 is to explore how to integrate literacy into vocabulary intervention. Just as narrative is considered the bridge between spoken and written language at the discourse level, I believe that vocabulary is that bridge at the word level. Here in part 2 of the presentation, I'll start by providing an overview of effective vocabulary instruction, but this is not intended to be a comprehensive review. There's a lot of literature out there about evidence-based vocabulary intervention. I'm just going to hit the highlights and then move into the literacy piece. First, take a moment to reflect. What do we already know, or what do you know, about effective vocabulary instruction? And what therapy techniques and procedures do you use to work on vocabulary? Considerations for effective instruction include targets, the words that we choose, techniques, how we target vocabulary, and student motivation. Student motivation and engagement is often an ignored component here, and it's especially important when asking children to do something that's hard for them, and word learning is hard for children with language disorder, so we really need their buy-in. And I like this quote from Graves, 2006. Kindling students' interest and engagement with words is a vital part of helping all students, but especially less advantaged students, to develop rich and powerful vocabularies. Okay, let's start with targets. How do we choose which words we want to work on in our therapy sessions? We might choose words from stories that the children are reading in the classroom or at home. We might choose words from the curriculum, could be from their language arts text, could be from social studies or science text. And we also think about words and topics based on the child's interest. And there may be other things that you take into consideration when you're choosing targets. In deciding which words to teach, the 3 tiers framework from Isabel Beck and colleagues is frequently used. Tier 1 words are the most basic everyday words. They're common in spoken language. They typically have just one meaning, and they rarely require specific instruction. Tier 2 words are high-frequency words that occur across a variety of domains. They're more sophisticated than the Tier 1 words, and they often have a Tier 1 synonym, and they also occur more often in written than in spoken language. So they're words of a mature language user and the words of written text. The example of the word furious that I have here as a Tier 2 word, you could think about a Tier 1 synonym being mad. And finally, the Tier 3 words are low-frequency words, and they're specific to a certain domain. We also consider them to be technical words. My favorite Tier 3 SLP word is diadochokinesis. So that would be primarily just used within our field, so a very specific technical usage. So when deciding which words to choose, you would want to choose the challenging and high utility words, and those are going to be the Tier 2 words. Building a child's Tier 2 vocabulary can have a big impact. And these are also words that are really great for writing. You're going to get some better lexical diversity and use of synonyms when you target the Tier 2 words instead of Tier 1. And of course, Tier 3 words will need to be targeted depending on the content area that you're working in. And sometimes we do need to target Tier 1 with children who have language disorder. They might not have acquired some of those words on their own and be having difficulty. So sometimes we need to, but one of the strategies that you can use is to pair it with a Tier 2 synonym whenever possible. So that's a way that you can add a little bit of that, the high utility words into your intervention. Another way to think about which words to teach is to think about academic vocabulary. These are high utility words that appear in academic, dialogue, and text. And the concept is similar to Tier 2 and Tier 3 classification. So general academic words would fall into Tier 2, and domain-specific academic words would fall into Tier 3. An important feature of academic vocabulary words is that they tend to be morphologically complex. They have complex structure. They commonly have derivational affixes and bound bases, very often from Latin and Greek roots. So these are really great words for teaching about morphological structure too. Moving on now to techniques. Beck and her colleagues in the book Bringing Words to Life taught us about robust vocabulary instruction. I've also got a little screenshot here of a review article by Steele and Mills. They've done a review, and as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of really good research and literature out there about doing rich or robust vocabulary instruction. I'll quickly review this list of techniques. First of all, we should use explicit instruction. We need to teach the words directly. We should use child-friendly definitions, and we should provide multiple exposures to the words in multiple contexts. So lots of practice has to be repetitive and contextualized, and we should actively engage the students by having them say the words, practice putting the words in sentences, and so on. So really keep it active rather than passive. We should provide examples and non-examples. We should activate and connect to the child's prior knowledge. And we should promote depth, deep knowledge of words by connecting to other words. And we can do this by using semantic webs, for example. I'll add here that I did a study with Laura Justice and some other colleagues in 2014, and we found that school-based SLPs aren't necessarily doing a great job of providing this rich instruction. They tend to limit to a few techniques and frequently choosing Tier 1 over Tier 2 and academic vocabulary words. So I say this because it is important to be aware of that, but also acknowledging, of course, that there are many reasons why this is the case. But I think it just behooves us to kind of take a step back and think about, are we providing robust vocabulary instruction to our students? What are some techniques that we can add to our repertoire and to really think about those Tier 2 words? At this point, you might be thinking to yourself, how can I possibly teach enough Tier 2 and academic vocabulary words to make a difference? Of course, we can't explicitly teach all of those words. That would take forever. But what we can do is teach word learning strategies to help children become independent in their word learning. It's the old teach them to fish adage, right? A really great word learning strategy is morphological analysis, teaching students about morphology and the structure of words and how to use that knowledge to figure out meanings of words. I'll talk more about that in the next video. Coming back now to motivation and engagement, I mentioned earlier that this doesn't always get the attention that it deserves. We should consider the students' preferences and interests when we choose words, materials, and activities. Definitely consider the level of challenge. We don't want it too easy or too difficult. And provide opportunities for meaningful discussion around topics of interest. So the more it can be connected to real life and have meaning for the student, the better. We can also model excitement for learning new words. So just getting the kids interested in that process of investigating and learning words and finding a level of joy and excitement in that. And we can do that through things like wordplay, word games, and jokes and idioms. Sometimes the use of technology can be really helpful for motivation and engagement. Not necessarily with all children, though, so we would have to keep that in mind. Before I move on, I wanted to share a few newly available resources with you, things that I discovered recently. These are all specific to teaching vocabulary for reading comprehension. So there's 2 videos there, one by Pamela Snow, Vocabulary Development and Early Reading Success, the What and Why, And part 2 of that by Emma McLean is How to Teach Vocabulary for Reading Comprehension. And then there's a podcast by Dr. Danielle Kohlenbrander about vocabulary for reading instruction. And I'll have all of these links in the handout. And the handout will be linked below the video. Okay, now we get to move into the good stuff. Let's start talking about integrating literacy into vocabulary intervention. If you recall from the first video, we talked about the fact that skilled reading and spelling involves the integration of semantics, phonology, morphology, and orthographic knowledge. And SLPs very often work only on that semantics piece, only the oral modality, so teaching about words and word meanings. But we have this opportunity to connect it to written language. When all representations are activated, we get higher lexical quality. There is, of course, educational relevance to integrating literacy into our intervention. SLPs working with school-age children are compelled to integrate oral and written language to ensure maximal language and literacy gains for students. Remember that children with language deficits are at risk for literacy difficulties, so we should include both the spoken and the written aspects of word knowledge. School-based SLPs really do need to be involved in literacy, so think broadly about how all of the skills relate. Think word knowledge and not just vocabulary. We're the language experts and we can pull all of this together. By building a child's word knowledge and lexical quality helps them to become efficient at word reading, which in turn affects their reading comprehension and their academic success. What are the techniques that we should use for integrating literacy into our vocabulary intervention? Just a reminder that we've gone through evidence in part 1 of this video and earlier in this video. And now we're sort of bringing these pieces and weaving them together. First and foremost, we should follow the principles of robust vocabulary instruction. We should also pair the pronunciations and spellings with word meanings, if you recall the orthographic facilitation and orthographic mapping from Linnea Airy. And then also make sure that we teach the phonology, the spelling, and the morphological structure of words, and do this explicitly and simultaneously. These features of words are really interconnected, and so we should ensure that our instruction reflects that. We should also keep in mind that we can use this approach and these types of techniques with children in all grades, even the early elementary grades. We've seen from the evidence that we don't necessarily need to wait to introduce some of those, what we might have thought were more complex linguistic concepts. I'd like to take some time now to talk a little bit about orthography. Before diving too far into literacy-related intervention, it's important to understand what orthography is and how the English orthographic system works. Orthography is defined as the conventional spelling system of a language. So it's our writing system, how we write words. If we analyze the morphological structure, we learn that, just like the word morphology, it's built from 2 Greek word-forming elements. The first one, O-R-T-H, denotes correct. G-R-A-P-H denotes writing. And then we have the suffix Y, which is a noun-forming suffix. So we can think of orthography as being correct writing. As children learn to read and spell, they acquire knowledge about orthography, and the work of Ken Oppel and others shows us that there's 2 types of orthographic knowledge. There's mental orthographic images. These are also called mental graphemic representations, and this is word-specific knowledge. So in the word rain, we have the phoneme A, and that phoneme has a variety of different graphemes that could potentially represent it in words. And so this mental orthographic image or mental graphemic representation is that visual image in our mind that the word rain is spelled with the AI digraph, and it doesn't have the A consonant E spelling. Orthographic patterns are those that apply across words, so they're not word specific. It's more about patterns that are allowable in English. So for example, the phoneme E can be represented with the graphemes EE, EA, or E consonant E. Also another example, the grapheme CK never occurs at the beginning of words in English. So these are the types of patterns that apply broadly across words in English orthography. Skilled readers and spellers have this knowledge without necessarily being explicitly aware of it, and we learn it through statistical learning, through exposure, but it can be difficult to draw this knowledge to the surface and explain specific rules or why certain spellings are legal, if you will, or illegal in English orthography. To take us into a little deeper understanding of how English orthography works, I'd like to start with this quote from Vinesky. The simple fact is that the present orthography is not merely a letter-to-sound system riddled with imperfections, but instead a more complex and more regular relationship wherein phoneme and morpheme share leading roles. I'm sure you'd agree with me when I say that most people believe English orthography is highly irregular and makes little sense, but once you understand the system, you realize it actually does make very good sense. And there are some facts that will make this easier to see. First, English is a morphophonemic language. English orthography is not just about phonology, but morphology plays a really important role. Morphophonemics refers to the fact that English orthography prioritizes the consistent spelling of morphemes over the consistent spelling of phonemes. And this preserves the visual identity of morphemes in written words. You can see the morphemes, and it highlights the meaning connections between words. I'll show you a few examples of that on the next slide. And because of these characteristics, we can say that the primary function of English orthography is to represent meaning, not sound. And this is in contradiction to how you are probably taught spelling, that you spell the sounds in words. So it's really hard for us to switch our mindset to seeing spelling as representing meaning. But when we make that switch, a lot of things make much more sense. Here are examples showing the consistency in spelling of morphemes even when pronunciation shifts. So each group of words share the same base, they're morphologically related, and you see that the base is spelled the same in each of the words, but the pronunciation of the graphemes changes across the words. So in the first group, we have sign, designate, and signature. The way I've laid them out here, you see very clearly that they all have S-I-G-N, and that's the base, and it carries the same meaning across the words, and therefore the spelling stays the same. So the morpheme is represented consistently across all of those words, even though the pronunciation changes a little bit. So in sign, you don't hear a G, but you hear it in designate and signature. The S in designate is different pronunciation from sign and signature, but it doesn't matter because the primary purpose of English spelling is to represent the meaning and to show the consistent spelling of morphemes. In the next example, we have compete, competition, and competitive. So again, you see that the vowels in this case change. We sometimes have a schwa sound in the first morpheme in the COM. Compete, competition, it sounds a little different, and the same with the grapheme represented by the E in the second morpheme. So we have compete and competition, so a long E, if you will, and a schwa. And then in the third word, competitive, that E is actually pronounced with an eh sound, so the E changes across all of those words. Then we have heal and health, where the EA changes its pronunciation, and act, action, and react, we see that the T in action sounds like a sh sound and not t, like in act and react. There are many, many examples like this in English. It's a feature of our orthographic system. And when we understand that the purpose is to represent meaning, we stop being annoyed that the spelling doesn't match what the word sounds like, and we can appreciate seeing the shared structure and meaning. And we're going to see some more examples of this in the next video as well. So with these facts in mind, then, we see that morphology is the key organizing principle for the orthographic system in English. And this is why the examples I'm going to talk about in the next video really focus on morphology. And then we also have an understanding that the conventions by which English spelling represents meaning are well ordered and reliable. Again, getting back to this idea that it's not just an irregular system, hodgepodge of everything. Things actually make sense. We just need to understand the basics of how the system works. In this model of English orthography from Real Spelling, you'll see that there's one more component, and that's etymology. The model shows that morphology, phonology, and etymology are all interwoven components within English orthography. I've said that spelling represents morphemes and phonemes, and it also preserves historical information and shows the interrelation of meaning between words. Etymology is the study of the origin of words and also the history of words and how they change in their sense and meaning over time. The study of etymology reveals relationships. So, for example, spellings are often grouped by meaning associations. An example of this would be here, there, and where. They all have that H-E-R-E spelling to show a meaning relationship. Also, letters can reveal relationships. For example, TW. So the W there is considered an etymological marker, and it shows the relationship between words like to, 20, and twin. So the W is not there for pronunciation in to, but it's showing us the historical relationship between to, 20, and twin, and other similar words. So etymology gives us insight into how a word's history affects its present day spelling. So it goes beyond thinking about roots and word origins. It's much more in-depth than that, and it plays a really important role in orthography. Okay, to conclude this section of my presentation, with knowledge of how English orthography works, SLPs are better equipped to leverage the interconnections between morphology, phonology, and etymology, and therefore to teach accurate and deep knowledge of words. In the next and final video in this presentation, I'll show you some examples of what this type of integrated spoken and written language intervention can look like. So I hope you'll join me in the next video.